The operating room at Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, Arizona, was kept at a temperature of approximately 60 degrees Fahrenheit. This was not unusual for a surgical theater. Lower temperatures reduce the risk of infection, slow bacterial growth, keep the instruments and the hands of those working with them at a controlled and predictable baseline. On the morning of August 3rd, 1991, the room was prepared for a procedure called a hypothermic cardiac arrest, which required the body temperature of the patient to be lowered deliberately to 60 degrees as well, matching the room until the heart stopped and the blood was drained from the brain entirely. The stillness this produced was not incidental to the surgery. It was the surgery. The brain needed to be empty of blood to allow the neurosurgical team to work on the giant basilar artery aneurysm at its base. There was no other way to reach it. The patient's name was Pam Reynolds. She was 35 years old. She was a musician from Atlanta, Georgia. She had been told there was no standard surgical option for the aneurysm she carried at the base of her brain, and that without intervention it would kill her, and that the intervention itself might kill her, and that if she chose to proceed, the procedure would involve stopping her heart and emptying her brain of blood for a period long enough that by every clinical definition available, she would be dead. She agreed to proceed. She arrived at Barrow Neurological Institute in August of 1991, was prepared for surgery, and was placed under general anesthesia by the team led by neurosurgeon Dr. Robert Spetzler. Her eyes were taped shut and fitted with molded earplugs through which clicking sounds were delivered to monitor her brainstem function. Her body temperature was lowered progressively until her heart stopped. Her blood was drained into a cardiopulmonary bypass machine. Her brain fell silent on the EEG. And then, sometime during the procedure, during the period when she was by every measurable clinical standard no longer conscious, no longer alive in the conventional sense of the word, she later said she became aware. She was not distressed by this, she said. She described the awareness as beginning with a kind of pulling sensation, as though she were being drawn upward through the top of her head. She described becoming aware of the room around her from a vantage point above her own body. She described seeing the surgical team at work. She described the sound of the bone saw they used to open her skull, a high natural D. She would later say she could identify it as a musician, and she described the appearance of the instrument itself. It was smaller than she expected. It looked, she said, like a small electric toothbrush. It had interchangeable tips, and those tips were stored in what looked to her like a case for socket wrenches, a case with separate foam-lined slots for each piece. She had not seen the instrument before the surgery. She had been under general anesthesia when it was brought into the field. Her eyes were taped shut throughout. Dr. Robert Spetzler, when interviewed about Reynolds' account, confirmed that her description of the Midas rex bone saw used in the procedure was accurate. The instrument does resemble a small electric toothbrush. Its tips are stored in a case of precisely the kind she described. These were not details available in standard medical literature or preoperative patient materials. They were the details of the specific instrument sitting in the specific room where she was, at a time when she was, by clinical measurement, not there at all. The case of Pam Reynolds sits in the documented record not because it is singular, but because it is unusually well attested. The surgical team was known. The neurosurgeon was willing to be interviewed. The instrument was specific and describable and confirmed. The conditions of her unconsciousness were among the most thoroughly documented in any reported near-death experience, not merely cardiac arrest, but the full clinical protocol of hypothermic circulatory arrest, designed precisely to eliminate all brain function, all blood flow, all measurable basis for conscious perception. What she reported having perceived during that state has not been satisfactorily explained by any mechanism available at the time of her surgery or since. There is a particular quality to the cases that belong to this category of documented perception. They are not characterized by dramatic content, visions of light, encounters with figures, feelings of peace or expansion, all of which appear in the broader literature of near-death experience and which may or may not yield to eventual neurological or psychological explanation. What distinguishes the cases worth examining carefully is something narrower and more difficult. It is the accuracy. It is the specific, verifiable, cross-confirmed accuracy of what patients described perceiving about the physical world they were not, by any available clinical measure, in a position to perceive. Pam Reynolds described the bone saw. A man in Connecticut described the movements of a surgeon. A woman in Seattle directed a social worker to the north-facing exterior ledge of a hospital 3 floors up. These are the cases that have attracted the most serious research attention, and they are the cases that, held against each available explanatory framework, have so far left the most specific and factual remainder that no framework fully accounts for. The story of the tennis shoe at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle begins in 1977 with a woman referred to in the published accounts by her first name only, Maria. She was a migrant worker who had been admitted to Harborview following a cardiac arrest. Her social worker was a woman named Kimberly Clark Sharp, who would later become one of the more frequently cited sources on the case, having investigated it directly and filed her account in published research material. Maria survived her cardiac arrest and recovered in a patient room at Harborview. When Sharp came to see her, Maria reported something that she seemed uncertain how to categorize. She said she had found herself floating outside the hospital during the period of her cardiac arrest. She said she had drifted upward along the exterior of the building. She said she had seen something on a ledge on the north-facing side of the 3rd floor, above the street facing outward. What she described was a single tennis shoe, dark blue, worn. One lace, she said, was tucked under the heel rather than laced properly. She described it as an old shoe. She described it with the particular attention someone pays to an object they have spent time looking at from close range. Kimberly Clark Sharp listened to this account, and she later wrote, found herself in an awkward position. The obvious response was to note the shoe and move on, treating it as the kind of detail that might appear in any account and mean very little. But Maria was insistent. The shoe was there, she said, on the ledge, north side, 3rd floor. Sharp agreed to look. What she found was the shoe, dark blue, worn, sitting on the north-facing exterior ledge of the 3rd floor of the building, one lace folded under the heel, precisely as Maria had described. Sharp went back to Maria with this confirmation and then went further. She examined whether any interior location in the hospital, any patient window, any corridor, any vantage point accessible to someone inside the building offered a line of sight to that particular ledge. What she established, and what she documented in her published account, was that the ledge was not visible from any interior patient area. It could not be seen from inside the building. It could not be seen from the patient rooms on that floor. It faced outward, away from the hospital's interior, over a street below. The shoe was recovered. It matched the description in every detail Sharp could verify. The account was filed in the research literature and has been cited in peer-reviewed publications on near-death experience phenomenology, including work associated with the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. It remains, decades after it was first documented, without a satisfactory explanation for how Maria's description could have been as accurate as it was. There is a tendency, when reading accounts like this, to look for the simplest available escape from the question they raise. Someone must have told her. She must have seen a photograph. She must have overheard a conversation. These possibilities are not unreasonable reflexes. They are the appropriate first questions any investigator should ask. What distinguishes the cases in this category from the wider body of near-death experience reports is that researchers have asked these questions specifically, in the particular cases, against the particular details, and the simplest escapes have not been available. In Maria's case, she was a migrant worker, admitted to a hospital in a city she was not from. She had not been to Harborview before her admission. She had been in cardiac arrest and then unconscious in a patient room. She had not left her room or had access to the exterior of the building or to any vantage point from which the north-facing ledge of the third floor was visible. The shoe had simply been sitting there, unnoticed, the way objects on exterior building ledges sit, present, unremarkable, facing the street. Al Sullivan was a truck driver from Connecticut. In 1988, he underwent quadruple bypass surgery. He was placed under general anesthesia in the standard manner, and the procedure was performed by a surgical team that included a cardiologist named Dr. Anthony LaSala. Sullivan later reported that during the surgery, he had found himself in a position above his own body, looking down at the operating table and the people around it. He described the room, he described aspects of the procedure, and he described something specific about the behavior of one of the surgeons, a gesture, a physical habit. He said he had observed the surgeon moving his elbows inward and outward against his body, a flapping motion, during the operation. This detail was investigated by Dr. Bruce Grayson of the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. What Grayson documented was that Dr. Anthony LaSala had a particular habit in the operating theater. When his hands were occupied with surgical instruments in the sterile field, he would use his elbows to gesture or to point, pressing them against his body and moving them outward in a specific way that other members of the surgical team recognized as his. It was not a common gesture. It was not something that would have been described in any pre-surgical consultation. It was not something Sullivan could have anticipated or researched. It was the kind of small, idiosyncratic physical habit that people develop over years of work in a specific environment, and that their colleagues absorb without particularly noting, because it has simply become part of the texture of working with that person. Sullivan described it. He described it, having observed it, he said, from above. He described it in the register of something he had simply seen. The case was documented by Grayson and has been included in the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies database, which represents one of the largest collections of formally investigated veridical near-death and out-of-body accounts in the world. What the documentation establishes is the match between what Sullivan described and what the surgical team confirmed. It does not establish how the match came to be. That question, in this case as in others, remains open. There is a particular case in the documented record that sits somewhat apart from the others, not because it is more dramatic, but because it removes from the question one assumption that underlies almost every other case in the category. Most accounts of visual perception during near-death experience are reported by people who can see, whose visual system, whatever its condition during the experience, is functional in ordinary waking life. The objection this allows is that the visual content of such experiences might be constructed from memory, imagination, or sensory fragments assembled by a brain under stress. What Vicky Umapeg's case makes unavailable is the assumption that the patient had visual memory or visual imagination to draw on at all. Vicky Umapeg was born with profound visual impairment due to retinal damage caused by excess oxygen during premature incubation. She had been congenitally blind since infancy. She had no functional visual experience of the world. She had never seen her own face, her own hands, or her own body. She had never seen the color of her own hair, or the appearance of her own clothing, or the shape of a wedding ring on her own finger. In the early 1970s, Vicky was involved in a serious car accident. She was admitted to hospital. During the period of her injury and the medical response to it, she later reported an experience that included, among other elements, a perception of looking down at her own body from above. She described what she saw. She described her long blonde hair. She described a gold wedding ring on her hand. She described a plaid shirt. These details were accurate. They were confirmed by sighted witnesses present at the scene and in the hospital. They were the details of a body she had never seen, and by the ordinary operation of her sensory experience, had no means of seeing. Her case was documented and investigated by researchers Kenneth Ring and Sharon Cooper, and published in their 1999 book Mindsight, which gathered accounts of near-death and out-of-body experiences reported by congenitally blind and visually impaired individuals. The book represented a systematic effort to address precisely the kind of dismissal that proposes that near-death visual experiences are reconstructions from existing visual memory, because in the cases Ring and Cooper collected, there was no existing visual memory to reconstruct from. What Vicky Umapeg described seeing in that hospital corridor was herself, as she had never seen herself, described accurately to people who could verify the details against their own ordinary vision. The description matched. The research documentation records the match. The mechanism by which it occurred has not been established. Sitting with these cases for any length of time, one encounters a particular quality in the documentation, a kind of patient precision on the part of the researchers who have investigated them. These are not, in the main, people given to dramatic claims. Bruce Grayson spent decades at the University of Virginia gathering case files with the methodological care of a researcher who understood that the strength of the work depended entirely on the rigor of the documentation. Kenneth Ring developed systematic research instruments for studying near-death experience phenomenology and applied them across large populations. Sam Parnia designed a study with concealed ceiling-mounted targets specifically to create the conditions under which an out-of-body perceptual claim could be cleanly tested. The seriousness with which these researchers approach the material is part of what makes the remaining questions, after decades of careful investigation, worth taking seriously as questions. The Aware I Study, Awareness During Resuscitation, was launched in 2008 and enrolled patients at hospitals across the United Kingdom, the United States, and Austria. The study's design by Dr. Sam Parnia and his colleagues was shaped by a precise awareness of the evidentiary problem. Anecdotal accounts of out-of-body perception during cardiac arrest, however numerous and however internally consistent, could not be evaluated against a hidden visual target after the fact. What was needed was a target that existed before any patient had their cardiac arrest, something placed in the resuscitation bay that could only be seen from a vantage point above the room, a vantage point that corresponded exactly to the vantage point patients had been describing for decades. The study placed images on shelves mounted near the ceilings of resuscitation bays. The images faced upward. They were visible only from above. Anyone standing or lying on the floor of the room could not see them. If a patient reported an out-of-body experience during resuscitation and described one of those images accurately, the description would constitute a form of evidence that purely neurological explanations would need to account for directly. The preliminary findings of the Aware Eye study, reported in the journal Resuscitation in 2014, included one case that met the threshold for verified out-of-body perception. The patient was identified as patient 10. He was 57 years old and had experienced a cardiac arrest at Southampton General Hospital. During the resuscitation, he later said he had found himself above his own body, watching the team work. He described specific actions of specific staff members. He identified a nurse who had entered the room only briefly. He described the room's appearance during a period when clinical records confirmed he was in cardiac arrest, unconscious by every available measure, his brain receiving no meaningful blood flow. His account was cross-checked against the testimony of the resuscitation team and against the clinical records of the procedure. The specific details he described, the nurse, the actions, the characteristics of the room during that phase of the resuscitation, were confirmed accurate. The period during which he reported having these perceptions was the period during which the clinical record shows him to have been in verified cardiac arrest, unconsciousness. Patient 10 was a single case in a study designed to gather many. The study did not resolve the question it was designed to address. No patient reported seeing the ceiling-mounted targets, which may reflect the genuine rarity of the specific perceptual phenomena or the difficulty of attending to an arbitrary visual target during an experience that patients consistently describe as far larger and more consuming than any single object in a room. What the study did produce was documentation of one instance of perception during a period of verified clinical unconsciousness, a case that has been available in the peer-reviewed literature since 2014, examined and contested and discussed, and not yet accounted for by any explanation. The research community has agreed upon. A detail worth dwelling on in the context of these cases is what they do not share. They are not linked by the emotional content of the experiences patients report. Some patients describe peace, some describe confusion, some describe a sense of hovering without strong emotional coloring. They are not linked by the specific visual content: the bone saw at Barrow, the tennis shoe at Harborview, the surgeon's elbow gesture in Connecticut, a plaid shirt on a woman who could not see, a nurse stepping briefly into a Southampton resuscitation bay. The content is entirely different in each case. What the cases share is narrower and more specific than content. They share the match. In each instance, something reported by a patient who was by clinical measure unconscious was subsequently confirmed accurate by an independent source, a surgical team, a social worker who went and looked, a cardiologist who recognized his own habit, cited witnesses who could verify details, a blind woman described, a resuscitation team whose testimony aligned with a patient's account. The match documented across cases gathered by researchers at multiple institutions across several decades is what the literature has not been able to place within a satisfying explanatory frame. The cases exist in different registers of documentation. Some are more carefully attested than others. Some involve investigators who spoke directly with the people who confirmed the details. Others involve more links in the evidentiary chain. Researchers in the field, including Grayson and Parnia, have noted the importance of distinguishing between cases where the verifying source is direct and those where it is more distant. The cases described here belong by the standards the researchers themselves have applied to the better attested portion of the record. They are the cases that have survived the closest scrutiny and continued to present the same basic unanswered question. What the question is, stated plainly, is this: how did they know? Not in the philosophical sense, not as a prompt for speculation about the nature of consciousness or the possibility of perception beyond the body, but in the flatly investigative sense. A woman who was clinically dead in a Phoenix operating theater accurately described an instrument she had never seen. A migrant worker in a Seattle hospital described a shoe on an exterior ledge invisible from every interior patient area. A truck driver in Connecticut described a surgeon's private gestural habit. A woman who had been blind since infancy described the physical appearance of her own body. A cardiac arrest patient in Southampton described the actions of a nurse who had stepped into the room for only a moment. In each case, the description was checked. In each case, the description matched. The literature does not resolve this. It documents it. The research continues with different methodologies at different institutions by researchers who hold different prior commitments about what the eventual explanation will look like. The documentation that currently exists, the case files, the interview transcripts, the cross-checked accounts, the peer-reviewed publications, holds the question open without pressing it toward any particular answer. There is something particular about the image of that tennis shoe on the ledge at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. It sat there the way ordinary objects sit when no one is looking at them, undisturbed, facing the street below, 3 floors above the city, on a gray Pacific Northwest afternoon in 1977. Its lace was folded under the heel. It was worn, dark blue, slightly weathered by whatever weather had found its way to that ledge. It had been there long enough that no one on the hospital staff had cause to notice it. It faced outward, toward no patient window, toward no interior corridor, toward nothing but the open air above the street. Kimberly Clark Sharp found it there. She documented what she found. She documented that no patient window offered a view of the ledge it sat on, that no interior vantage point could account for the specificity of the description she had been given. She went back to Maria and confirmed what Maria had said. She filed the account. It entered the research literature, and it has remained in the research literature since. A small and specific and very ordinary object, sitting in a very specific and documented location, wearing the particular worn appearance that Maria described from a position she had no physical means of occupying. How that description came to exist with the accuracy it has is not a question the record has answered. The shoe was there. The description matched. The ledge was not visible from inside. Those are the documented facts, and they have not been revised by anything that has been published since. And the question they frame, patient, unhurried, as simple and particular as a dark blue tennis shoe on a concrete ledge, has simply continued to sit, undisturbed, facing outward, waiting. In the cardiac wards of 10 Dutch hospitals in the late 1980s, the days moved in a rhythm that had very little to do with mystery. Beds were made, medications were administered on schedule. Monitoring equipment ran its continuous traces across screens mounted at the nurses' stations, each line a record of a heart, still working, still holding to its pattern. The corridors were tiled and ordinary. The staff moved through them with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this work for years. Nothing about the physical setting suggested that the data being quietly accumulated across those wards would eventually reach one of the most rigorous medical journals in the world and sit there unresolved for decades. Between 1988 and 1992, Dutch cardiologist Dr. Pim van Lommel was enrolling patients into a study that was, on its surface, procedurally straightforward. 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest across those 10 hospitals were asked following recovery whether they had any memory of the period during which their hearts had stopped. The methodology was prospective, Patients were enrolled before the researchers knew what, if anything, they would report, and the clinical records of each patient were kept alongside whatever account they gave. Medication type, duration of arrest, pre-existing conditions. Everything that could be measured was measured and set beside everything that could be reported, and then the two columns were compared. The study was not small. It was not conducted in a single institution by a single team working from a shared assumption. It was distributed across 10 hospitals, across years, and its data collection was as orderly as the wards it drew from. What the data found was not what a straightforward physiological account of the experience would have predicted. Approximately 18% of those 344 survivors reported memories from the period of their clinical death, not vague impressions, not the ordinary disorientation of a patient waking from unconsciousness. What they described had consistent shape and content, shape that researchers across several fields had by that point been documenting for over a decade, content that Van Lommel's team recorded carefully and set alongside the clinical data, and then they looked for the pattern the physiological account would require. If these experiences were produced by the brain under specific forms of stress, by the particular chemistry of a heart in arrest, by the specific character of the crisis, then there should be a measurable difference between the patients who reported them and those who did not. The medication administered should differ. The duration of the arrest should correlate. Some measurable variable in the clinical record should mark one group apart from the other. No such variable was found. The 18% who reported experiences and the 82% who did not were by every physiological measure the study recorded, statistically indistinguishable. The same medications had been administered to both groups. The same range of arrest durations appeared in both groups. The same pre-existing conditions were distributed across both groups without pattern. What the data showed was a gap, a space where the expected clinical explanation would sit, if one existed, and the gap remained empty. Van Lommel's team wrote this up carefully, submitted it to The Lancet and in December 2001, the paper was published. The finding did not resolve the question. It made the question more precisely located. The Lancet paper moved through the research community slowly and with attention. It was not the first systematic study of near-death experience reports, but it was the most rigorously designed prospective study, yet published in a major peer-reviewed medical journal, and its methodology was not easily dismissed. Other researchers read it and began to consider what a next step in the investigation might look like. The question Van Lommel's study had positioned so clearly, not whether these experiences occurred, but what produced them and why the physiological record held no predictive signal, was the question that a cardiologist and researcher named Dr. Sam Parnia began designing a study to address, and the design he arrived at was considerably more elaborate than anything that had preceded it. The Aware I study, standing for awareness during resuscitation, was launched in 2008 across 15 hospitals in 3 countries, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Austria. 2,060 cardiac arrest patients were enrolled over the course of the study. That number alone placed it among the largest prospective studies of near-death experience to date. But what distinguished Aware I from the studies that came before it was not its scale alone. It was what had been placed in the resuscitation bays before a single patient arrived. On shelves mounted near the ceiling, in those bays, positioned above the eye line of any person standing on the floor, visible only from a vantage point well above the room, were concealed images, face down on their surfaces, accessible to no one entering the room through the door, visible from no angle available to a patient, lying on the table, or a staff member moving through the ordinary conduct of a resuscitation. The images were placed there specifically to serve as verification targets. If a patient reported an out-of-body experience during cardiac arrest, reported floating above the room, looking down at the people working below, the question the study was designed to address was whether that patient could identify what was on the shelf, whether the reported vantage point was a subjective impression that happened to feel elevated, or whether it corresponded to an actual position in physical space from which the image would have been visible. The shelf was positioned and waiting. The images sat on it face down through every resuscitation the Bay saw for the duration of the study. Preliminary findings from the AWARE 2 phase of the study indicated that approximately 10% of the cardiac arrest survivors who were interviewable, who had recovered sufficiently to be interviewed, which was itself a fraction of the total enrolled, reported some form of awareness or perceptual experience during the period of resuscitation. That figure was noted and recorded. The shelves with their face-down images had been in place throughout. The question of whether any of those patients had perceived what the images showed remained, as of the most recent published research. The question the study's design had been built to answer, and the methodological work of placing those shelves, of designing a visual target that would distinguish verified spatial perception from coincidence or inference, was itself a document of how seriously the question had come to be taken. The question had been taken seriously at the University of Virginia for considerably longer. The Division of Perceptual Studies there was founded by psychiatrist Dr. Ian Stevenson in 1967, and its work had by the time Van Lommel published his Lancet paper accumulated decades of documented case material across several related areas of inquiry, including near-death experience, out-of-body perception, and what researchers in the field called veridical accounts, reports in which something perceived during an anomalous experience was subsequently confirmed against an independently verifiable external fact. The division continued under Dr. Bruce Grayson, whose contributions to the field included the development of the Grayson NDE scale. The scale was a 16-item self-report instrument designed to standardize the assessment of near-death experiences in a way that allowed comparison across studies, across institutions, and across populations. Before it existed, researchers in different hospitals and different countries were using their own questions and their own descriptive frameworks, and the data they collected could not easily be placed beside each other. The Grayson scale changed that. It gave the field a shared vocabulary and a shared measurement tool, and it became the most widely cited assessment instrument in near-death experience research. The scale itself was not a claim about the nature of what it measured. It was simply a way of measuring it consistently, of giving the same careful question to a patient in Virginia and a patient in the Netherlands and a patient in Wales, and being able to place their answers in the same column and look at them together. The filing cabinets in the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia held, by any reasonable description, the largest collection of systematically documented veridical NDE and out-of-body cases in the world. Interview transcripts, hospital records obtained with patient consent, correspondence with surgical staff and attending physicians, notes from follow-up interviews conducted months or years after the original event. The cases in those files had been collected across several decades, across many countries, and across a wide range of clinical settings. They were not cherry-picked for their strangeness. They were collected because they included independently verifiable elements, details that could be checked against a source outside the patient's own account, and because they had been checked. What the files held was not evidence of a conclusion. What they held was a very large and carefully organized record of the question and of how precisely the question had been located across all the years of work. In a laboratory at the University of Michigan in 2013, a research team led by Dr. Jimo Borjigian was pursuing the question from a different direction entirely. The approach was animal model neuroscience, not human clinical research, and what it produced was a finding that moved quickly through science journalism and arrived in public discussion with considerably more certainty attached to it than the original paper supported. Following induced cardiac arrest in rats, with EEG leads attached to monitor brain electrical activity, Borjigian and colleagues recorded a surge of highly synchronized gamma wave activity in the first 30 seconds after the heart stopped. Gamma waves occupy the higher frequency range of brain electrical activity and are associated in the research literature with states of heightened cognitive integration, with the kind of coordinated, coherent neural processing that occurs during focused attention or complex conscious experience. The surge was not what the team had necessarily expected to find. It was clear in the data, and it was brief, a spike rising and then falling within the window of the first half minute following cardiac arrest, and it was interpreted by some observers as a possible neural correlate of the vivid, organized experience that near-death reports describe. The interpretation was noted and contested, and the contestation was specific. Researchers, including Dr. Sam Parnia, observed that the accounts patients gave in studies like Van Lummel's and in AWARE were not accounts of experiences associated with the first 30 seconds of cardiac arrest. When patients described the content of what they reported, the spatial perception, the life review, the organized sequence of events, they associated that content with the deepest phase of unconsciousness, not with the onset of arrest or the recovery phase. The experiences, as reported, were not clustered at the edges of the unconscious period. They were placed by the patients themselves at its center. The gamma surge Borjigian's team had recorded occurred within the first 30 seconds and then resolved. The timing did not match what the human accounts required, and the mismatch was noted by multiple researchers in the field as a reason to hold the Michigan findings as suggestive rather than explanatory, a genuinely interesting data point that did not yet bridge the gap the human clinical data had opened. The University of Michigan finding also raised a more fundamental methodological consideration that researchers in the field had been working with since the beginning. All of the neural correlates of conscious experience identified in neuroscience research to that point had been identified in brains that were functioning. The gamma surge in the dying rats was by definition occurring at the boundary of that functionality, a brief electrical event in a system transitioning out of the conditions under which consciousness had been understood to operate. Whether the organized cognitive content of near-death experience reports could be mapped to that event, or to any event in a system in that state, was a question the data did not settle. Standard clinical EEG monitoring of cardiac arrest patients had established a timeline that sat at the center of the scientific debate about near-death experience reports, and remained there regardless of which specific hypothesis was under examination. When the heart stops beating, the blood carrying oxygen to the brain ceases to circulate. The brain responds quickly. Electrical activity, as measured by scalp EAG, typically flatlines within 10 to 20 seconds of cardiac output ceasing. The cerebral cortex, the outermost layer of the brain, responsible for conscious thought, sensory processing, language, and the formation and retrieval of memory, is among the first regions to lose function. It is not the last casualty of oxygen deprivation, it is among the first. That timing creates a problem for every physiological account of near-death experience that has been proposed. The experiences patients report are not brief. They are described as extended, coherent, narratively organized, and perceptually detailed. They include specific sensory content, what the room looked like, what people said, where objects were positioned. They include the kind of structured sequential experience that in ordinary waking consciousness requires the ongoing operation of exactly the cortical systems that EEG monitoring shows going offline within seconds of cardiac arrest. The timeline places the reported experience in a window for which current neuroscience has no established mechanism of conscious experience generation. This is not a rhetorical observation made by advocates for any particular interpretation of near-death reports. It is a structural feature of the data that researchers across the debate, including those who hold that a neurological explanation will eventually be found, have acknowledged as the core difficulty. The flat line on the EEG monitor was, in this sense, not merely a medical observation about an individual patient's brain. It was the boundary against which every hypothesis had to be measured. On one side of that line was the full operation of the neural machinery of consciousness. On the other side was documented clinical silence, and placed against that silence were patient accounts describing organized, detailed, perceptually specific experience that, in some documented cases, included accurate information about the physical environment that the patients had no ordinary means of perceiving. The hospitals where Van Lummel's study was conducted had not changed much in the years since the data was collected. Cardiac wards in the Netherlands in the early 1990s looked very much as cardiac wards do anywhere. The same tiled corridors, the same monitoring equipment, the same rhythms of shift change and medication rounds. The 344 patients who passed through those wards and into the study did so in the ordinary course of receiving care for a genuine medical emergency. They were not research subjects first, they were patients first, and the study enrolled them in that order. When some of them recovered and were asked whether they remembered anything from the period their hearts had stopped, the question was put simply and recorded carefully, and what they said was added to the files alongside the blood pressure readings and the medication logs and the duration of arrest. The range of experience reported by the 18% who described memories from that period was not uniform. Some described only a sense of peace or light. Some described more organized experiences with sequential content, leaving the body, moving through a passage, encountering other people. The variation was itself part of the data. The Grayson NDE scale, applied consistently, allowed the researchers to place each account along a spectrum and compare them across the full sample, to ask not only who reported an experience, but how complex and how complete the experience was, and whether the complexity or completeness correlated with any clinical variable. It did not. The distribution of experience complexity across the 18% who reported NDEs was as statistically uncorrelated with physiological variables as the occurrence of the experience itself. The 82% who reported no memory from the period of arrest were not, as far as the clinical record showed, different people. They had not had smoother arrests. Their medications had not been more carefully calibrated. Their brains had not been more protected. They had simply not reported anything, and the clinical data offered no signal for why. That absence was also part of the finding. An experience reliably produced by a specific physiological state would be expected to correlate with the features of that state. The absence of correlation was not, by itself, an explanation for what the 18% reported. It was a data point that made the question more specific. Van Lommel had spent years reading across the field before designing his study, and he was familiar with the primary alternative frameworks through which near-death experiences had been explained by researchers working from a physiological starting point: oxygen deprivation, carbon dioxide accumulation, the release of endogenous chemical compounds during crisis, residual neural activity at the margins of consciousness. Each of these had been proposed with varying degrees of supporting evidence, and each made predictions about the clinical profile of patients who would be expected to report experiences. The prospective design of Van Lommel's study was calibrated specifically to test those predictions. Blood gas levels were measured and recorded. Medication types and dosages were documented. The data was placed in the same analysis as the experience reports and examined for the correlations each hypothesis required. The oxygen deprivation hypothesis predicted that patients with lower oxygen levels during arrest would be more likely to report NDEs because the experience would be a product of cortical disruption produced by hypoxia. The data did not support this. Carbon dioxide accumulation, the hypercarbia hypothesis, predicted the reverse: higher CO2 would produce more reports. The data did not support this either. The measured blood gas levels showed no statistically significant difference between the patients who reported NDEs and those who did not. Both groups had arrested. Both groups had by definition experienced the complete cessation of normal oxygenated blood flow to the brain. Within that shared condition, the specific measurable features of that state held no predictive power over who would report an experience afterward. The data from Van Lommel's study was not the only evidence bearing on these hypotheses, and the hypotheses were not without defenders. But the *Lancet* paper placed the Dutch findings in a form that required a response from anyone who wanted to maintain the simpler physiological accounts, and the response it received over the years following its publication was not a refutation. It was, for the most part, a more careful acknowledgement of what remained to be explained. The 15 hospitals enrolled in the AWARE-I study had their ceiling shelves. Their concealed images sat face down in the resuscitation bays through every cardiac arrest the study period encompassed. The logic of the design was straightforward and had been carefully thought through. If a patient's report of floating above the room was purely subjective, a felt experience of elevation without any corresponding spatial reality, then that patient would have no more access to the image on the shelf than a patient who reported no experience at all. But if the reported vantage point corresponded in some way to an actual position in the physical space of the room, if there was something in the experience that placed the patient's perception at a height and angle from which the image would be visible, then the patient, upon recovery, might describe what was on the shelf. The shelf was the test. The image was the question. The design did not require the researcher to resolve anything in advance. It required only that the shelf be there and that the question be asked. The interviewable fraction of the 2,060 enrolled patients, those who survived and recovered to a degree that allowed conversation, was itself a small number. The nature of cardiac arrest and its aftermath is such that many patients who experience it do not recover. Of those who do, many experience cognitive effects that make detailed recall difficult. The 10% who reported some form of awareness or perceptual experience during resuscitation were drawn from that already reduced pool, and their accounts were collected, recorded, and placed alongside the clinical data in the same way Van Lommel's team had done a decade and a half earlier in those 10 Dutch hospitals. The comparison between what those patients described and what the shelves held, The central evidentiary question the study's design was built to answer was part of the ongoing analysis. The preliminary figures that had been reported indicated that the study had produced data worth examining carefully. The examination was continuing. The shelves were no longer in place. The study's data collection phase had concluded. But the question the shelves had been designed to address was still the question the field was working on, and the aware design had brought it closer to the kind of verifiable form in which it could, in principle, be answered, or at least more precisely defined. There is a particular quality to the kind of scientific work being done in this area, a quality that comes from the subject matter sitting at the intersection of several different disciplines, none of which has full jurisdiction over the question. Neuroscience provides the framework for understanding what the brain does under normal and abnormal conditions. Cardiology provides the clinical record of what happens to the body during cardiac arrest and resuscitation. Psychiatry and psychology provide the tools for assessing what patients report and how reliably they report it. And perceptual research, the careful, slow work of documenting cases in which what a person reports corresponds to something that can be independently verified, provides the specific file of anomalies that the other disciplines are being asked to account for. No single discipline has been able to close the question from within its own tools. The neurologist can describe what the EEG shows. The cardiologist can describe the blood gas levels. The psychiatrist can administer the Grayson scale and score the account. And at the end of all that, the file from the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia is still there in the filing cabinet, holding its documented correspondences between what patients reported and what was independently confirmed. And the question of how those correspondences arose is still open. The laboratories and hospitals and filing cabinets and peer-reviewed journals that make up the landscape of this research are not unusual places. They are the ordinary institutions of scientific inquiry, staffed by researchers who are for the most part methodologically conservative and careful about what their data shows and does not show. Van Lommel did not publish his Lancet paper to make a metaphysical argument. He published it because he had data from 344 patients across 10 hospitals, and the data showed something that the existing physiological frameworks did not predict. Parnia did not design the ceiling shelves in the Aware study as a theatrical gesture. He designed them because the question required a test with verifiable stakes, because the difference between a felt elevation and an actual spatial position was a difference that could, in principle, be measured. The EEG monitor in a cardiac resuscitation room does not stop recording during a resuscitation. It continues to run its trace across the screen throughout the event, the flat green line extending across the paper, 1 second after another, while the team works and the equipment runs and the room remains fully active around the still body on the table. The flat line is not absence. It is a recorded measurement. It is documentation of what the instrument finds when it looks for the electrical activity of a functioning brain and does not find it. The line is precise and factual and sits in the clinical record alongside everything else the resuscitation produced. The timing of interventions, the medications administered, the sequence of shocks delivered, the moment, if one came, when a pulse returned. In some of those records, clipped beside the EEG trace or filed in the same folder with the monitoring data, is a patient's account of what they reported experiencing during the period the trace was flat. The account is precise in its own way. It describes a room, a position, a sequence, a detail. It is a different kind of document from the EEG trace, but it is a document of the same period, and it is filed in the same place. The two pieces of paper face each other across the interior of the folder, and between them is the question that Van Lommel's Lancet paper made formally precise, that the Aware Studies ceiling shelves were designed to test, and that the flat green line on the EEG trace makes unavoidable. The cardiac wards of those 10 Dutch hospitals have continued to operate in the years since the study concluded. Beds made, medications administered on schedule, the monitoring equipment running its traces. The research moved outward from those wards into journals and conferences, and the design of new studies in new hospitals on different continents. The question moved with it. The flat line on the EEG monitor represents a window. 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 at most, before the cortex goes silent, and it is inside that window, or somewhere in the long silence that follows it, that the experiences patients describe are placed. The window is documented and measurable. What the window contains is not yet established. The green line runs across its paper, steady and unbroken, and the question it carries runs alongside it at the same unhurried pace. In the early 1980s, a researcher sat down with a cardiac patient in a hospital recovery room and asked a question so simple it barely sounds like science. He asked the patient to describe, as precisely as they could, the room where their resuscitation had taken place, the layout, the equipment, the arrangement of the machines. Dr. Michael Sabom was not yet certain what he expected to find. He had his notebook. He had the patient in front of him. He had a question that seemed, at first, to have a straightforward answer. Either the patient's description would match the room, or it would not. What Sabom found, working through this comparison across multiple patients in the material that would become his 1982 book Recollections of Death was a consistent and measurable difference between two groups. One group had experienced a near-death episode during their cardiac arrest and reported memories from that period. The other group had experienced cardiac arrest without reporting any NDE. Both groups were asked to describe the resuscitation room. The NDE group was significantly more accurate in spatial detail, in procedural sequence, in the specific arrangement of equipment. The difference was not marginal. It was consistent enough to document, to compare, to present in a published volume. One patient in particular stands out in the record Sabom compiled. He was a former U.S. Air Force aircraft mechanic. He had spent years around complex machinery, around instrument panels, around the particular vocabulary of analog dials and measurement readouts. When he described the defibrillator used during his resuscitation, he described it the way a man describes a piece of equipment he has looked at. He named the red line marker on one of the dials. He described the shock delivery sequence, the charge, the pause, the moment of delivery, in an order confirmed by the resuscitation team as accurate. He described the specific configuration of the machine's face with the kind of precision that comes not from having been told something, but from having seen it. The defibrillator was not a machine he would have examined before his cardiac arrest. It was not the kind of equipment discussed in pre-admission paperwork or standard medical consultations. The specific model in use in that resuscitation room was not something that appeared in commonly available medical literature of the period. What the mechanic described was the machine as it stood in that room, in that configuration, during the procedure, described with the same matter-of-fact accuracy he might have brought to describing an instrument panel on an aircraft he had worked on for a decade. Sabom's methodology was straightforward. He was not asking patients to guess. He was not prompting them with options. He sat across from them, opened his notebook, and asked them to describe what they remembered seeing. The control group, cardiac patients who had not reported an NDE, performed significantly worse when asked the same question. They described the room in general terms, or misremembered equipment placements, or described the experience from the perspective of a patient lying on a table, which is to say, from the perspective of someone who had not seen much of the room at all. The NDE group described specific details from angles that would require an elevated perspective, not the ceiling, not the wall, but something intermediate, something above and to the side of the table, a perspective that matched the descriptions patients gave of where they had felt themselves to be. The pattern Sabam documented was not a single outlier, it was a consistent gradient, and among the details that gradient contained, the dial positions, the procedural sequences, the arrangement of instruments along the edges of the resuscitation bay, the mechanic's defibrillator description, sat as one of the clearest, most technically specific, and most thoroughly documented accounts in the file. At Southampton General Hospital, some years later, a different kind of verification was taking place. In the Aware Eye study, which enrolled cardiac arrest patients across multiple hospitals and collected detailed testimony from survivors, one patient, identified in the published record only as patient 10, reported a particular set of perceptions during a period of verified cardiac arrest, unconsciousness. The patient was 57 years old. The resuscitation had been extensive. The clinical team worked through a full arrest protocol, and the patient's cardiac output was absent for the relevant period, not reduced, not diminished, but absent, as confirmed by the monitoring equipment running throughout. When patient 10 described what he remembered from that period, he described the room. He described the actions of staff members moving through it. He described a nurse who had stepped into the resuscitation bay for a brief moment and then stepped back out, a detail so small, so peripheral to the main activity of the resuscitation that it would not have appeared in any standard record of the procedure. The nurse's presence in the room for that brief interval was confirmed by the resuscitation team's testimony when researchers reviewed the case. She had been there, she had stepped in, and she had stepped back out. The patient, whose brain was producing a flat EEG line for the duration of the period he was describing, had placed her there correctly. He also described a voice. One staff member had said to another, across the room, to keep going. Those words, that instruction, passed in real time between two people doing their work in a resuscitation bay, and patient 10 reported them. The instruction was confirmed. The exchange had taken place. What the monitoring equipment was recording at the moment the exchange took place was the unbroken flat line of clinical unconsciousness. These details were not things a patient could have assembled from pre-procedure information, from medical knowledge, or from any reasonable inference about what happens in a resuscitation room. The nurse's brief presence was incidental. The spoken instruction was ordinary, the kind of thing said in any resuscitation and not recorded in any chart. The room in the midst of the procedure was not the room a patient ever sees. It is a room that opens fully only when the patient is no longer in a position to see it, when the table has become a surface and the person on it has become a body. The staff are working to change back into a patient. Patient 10 described the room from that moment, and what he described held. The case of Al Sullivan adds another angle to the same question. Sullivan was a truck driver from Connecticut. In 1988, he underwent quadruple bypass surgery, an extensive cardiac procedure requiring the opening of the chest, the bypassing of the heart's normal function, and a carefully sequenced protocol that unfolds over several hours in a highly controlled surgical environment. Sullivan had no medical training. He had not worked in a surgical context. His exposure to cardiac surgery before the procedure was limited to what any patient encounters in preoperative consultation, which does not extend to the instruments laid out on the surgical tray or the specific behavioral habits of the operating surgeon. What Sullivan reported after the procedure was a description of observing his surgeon from above. He described the surgeon's hands held away from the sterile field, a standard posture during gowning and gloving, practiced to avoid contamination, and then described something particular about the surgeon's arms. He described the surgeon moving his elbows inward and outward against his body. Not his hands, his elbows, a small repetitive gesture, the kind of gesture a person develops without deciding to, the kind that becomes invisible to everyone in a room because everyone in a room accepts it as simply what that person does. Dr. Anthony LaSala, the cardiologist involved in Sullivan's care, confirmed that the gesture Sullivan described was accurate. It was a known idiosyncratic habit, a sterile field behavior the surgeon had developed, and that his regular staff had long since stopped noticing. It was not documented in medical literature. It was not something Sullivan would have seen in any preoperative setting. It was the kind of detail that exists only inside the room where the surgery happens, visible only to the people who are in that room and awake and watching, which is to say, everyone except the patient. Dr. Bruce Grayson of the University of Virginia, Division of Perceptual Studies, investigated and documented the Sullivan case as part of a larger body of work on veridical NDE accounts. The retractor Sullivan described, a handheld instrument used during the procedure, was also confirmed by surgical staff to match the specific model in use at the hospital at that time. Two separate pieces of technical detail, both from a patient with no medical training, both confirmed by the people who were in the room. In Wales, in a different decade, a different kind of record was being made. Dr. Penny Sartori spent 5 years working in an intensive care unit, not as a researcher visiting from outside, but as a nurse embedded in the ward, present for the procedures, familiar with the protocols, present for the recoveries. She conducted her prospective study on near-death experiences in hospitalized intensive care patients from within the clinical environment itself, which gave her access to something that visiting researchers do not always have: the actual nursing records, the actual staff testimony, the actual procedural notes from each resuscitation in which a patient later reported an NDE. One patient she documented recovered from cardiac arrest, and during a conversation with Sartori, asked to describe what he remembered. He did not describe it in words alone. He picked up a piece of paper and drew it. He drew the position of his own body on the table, and specifically, the position of his left arm. His left arm in the drawing was crossed over his chest. This is not a standard resuscitation posture. In most resuscitation protocols, the arms are positioned at the sides, or positioned to allow for access and chest compression. Crossing a patient's left arm over the chest is an unusual choice. It is not impossible. Nursing staff make positioning decisions based on the circumstances of each individual resuscitation, but it is not the default. The nursing records from this patient's resuscitation confirmed that the left arm had been placed across the chest, a positioning choice that no one would have mentioned to the patient before, during, or after the procedure had been noted in the record. The patient, describing and drawing his position from what he reported as an elevated perspective, matched that record. Sartori published her findings in her 2008 book, Asterisk, The Near-Death Experiences of Hospitalized Intensive Care Patients. Asterisk, alongside a systematic account of the methodology she had used to verify each case. The Welsh ICU is not a prestigious research institution. It is a fluorescent lit ward in a working hospital, staffed by nurses who have other responsibilities, structured around the immediate care of critically ill patients. The study Sartori conducted within it was prospective. She enrolled patients before their outcomes were known and collected testimony afterward, which is considered a stronger methodological design than retrospective collection, where researchers gather accounts after the fact and then attempt to verify details that may have had time to shift. The detail of the crossed arm is not the kind of thing that captures attention when it is read in isolation. It is small. It is specific. It is the kind of procedural note that a nursing record contains because nursing records contain everything, including the things that will never become significant. In the context of Sartori's study, it became significant for a single reason. A patient who had no means of observing his own resuscitation described his own body's position in a way that matched the record of how his body had actually been positioned. Not approximately, not in general terms, with the specific detail of the arm crossed over at the chest. Dr. Sark, de Bastrain Bacter Saucters Perwact. Melvin Morse worked with pediatric patients. In his 1990 book Closer to the Light he documented accounts from children who had experienced near-death episodes and reported perceptions from beyond the boundaries of their own unconscious bodies. Children young enough, in some cases, to have limited access to the cultural vocabulary of near-death experience that adults might be more likely to have absorbed from books or television or other accounts they had heard. One of the cases Morse documented involved a child who reported seeing a clock on a wall. The child had been in cardiac arrest. During the period of the arrest, while the code was ongoing, while the medical team was working through the resuscitation protocol, the child reported hovering above the room and looking down. From that elevated position, the child reported seeing the clock, and the child reported a specific time on that clock, the position of the hands, the number the minute hand was pointing toward. Nursing records maintain a time log of cardiac codes. The onset of a code, the moment it is called, the moment the resuscitation formally begins, is entered into the record at the time it occurs. The time the child described seeing on the clock corresponded to the nursing notes entry for the onset of the cardiac code. The minute hand at a particular number, the number in the record, the same. Clocks on pediatric ward walls are not unusual. They are not positioned to be meaningful. They are positioned to be functional, to allow nursing staff to time medications, to record onset and duration, to do the ordinary bookkeeping of medical care. A child hovering above a resuscitation would see one not because it was placed there to be seen, but because it was simply there, on the wall as it always was, its hands at whatever position the time required. The time was recorded. The time was reported. They were the same time. What Morse's work with pediatric populations adds to the broader record is not simply additional cases. It is cases from a group whose exposure to NDE accounts and cultural narratives about dying is substantially more limited than an adult population's would be. A child who has not read Raymond Moody, who has not heard a relative's account, who has not absorbed the cultural template of the near-death experience through years of ambient cultural contact, and who nonetheless describes hovering above a room, seeing a clock, seeing a specific time. That description sits in a different position than an adult account might. It is not a more credible description by virtue of the child's age, but it is a description that comes with a different set of prior exposures, a different cultural vocabulary, a different access to the information that critics might invoke when explaining why adult accounts so often resemble each other. The clock on the wall of the pediatric ward is not a dramatic image, it is a plain institutional object. It tells the time. It does not know what is happening beneath it. It was on the wall before the code was called, and it was on the wall after the resuscitation ended, and it will be on the wall tomorrow. The child described it at a particular minute. The record shows the same minute. What lies between those two facts is the question that Morse's documentation raises and does not answer. Across these cases taken together, the mechanic and the defibrillator dial, patient 10 and the nurse who stepped briefly into the room, Sullivan and the elbow gesture of a surgeon who didn't know he had one, the Welsh patient drawing his own crossed arm on a sheet of paper, the child, and the clock, a pattern emerges that is not simply a pattern of detail, it is a pattern of access. Each account contains something the patient had no ordinary means of knowing, not something general, not something that could have been inferred from the circumstances, not something that could have been absorbed in advance from the environment of a hospital room or a preoperative consultation, but something specific, procedural, incidental, the kind of detail that exists only inside the moment it belongs to. The verification of each case followed the same basic logic Sabum used in his comparison study. Researchers took the account. They traced each specific detail against the available record, nursing notes, staff testimony, surgical inventories, equipment logs, procedural documentation. They looked for the point where the account either matched or diverged. In the cases documented here, the accounts matched. Not in every detail, across every account. Veridical NDE research does not claim a perfect record, and the researchers involved have been careful to note the limits of their data. But in the specific details that were verifiable, in the cases where a particular claim could be checked against a particular record, the match held. This is not the same as an explanation. The match between a patient's account and a clinical record is a documented correspondence. It says something happened. It does not say what happened or why the account was accurate or what mechanism produced a perception in a brain that monitoring equipment recorded as clinically silent. The correspondence is a fact. The question behind it is still open. What the researchers involved, Sabum, Grayson, Sartori, Morse, and the team behind the AWARE study have consistently noted is that the ordinary accounts of this kind of error work in a specific direction. People filling in gaps in memory tend to confabulate toward the familiar, the expected, the culturally plausible. They describe things as they might expect them to be, rather than as they were. They describe operating rooms from the perspective of a patient on a table, not from an elevated perspective that places equipment details and staff movements in a different spatial relation. They describe the general arc of a resuscitation, not the specific behavioral tic of a particular surgeon. The cases documented in veridical NDE research do not match the pattern of confabulation. They match the pattern of accurate observation. And the observation they describe is one that could not, by the ordinary rules of perception, have been made at the time it was reportedly made, from the body it reportedly came from, in the physiological state that body was documented to be in. The cardiac resuscitation record is a careful document. It notes times, it notes actions, it notes which staff member administered which medication, which sequence of interventions was applied, which instruments were used, and in what order. It notes when a patient's cardiac output ceased and when it returned. It notes, in some cases, the positions in which a patient's limbs were arranged, the moment a nurse stepped into the room to assist, the words that passed between staff members across the ongoing work of the code. These are not details that find their way into any account a patient could receive before or after the fact. They are the internal record of a room that was operating carefully, professionally, urgently, around a body that was not. They are the notes of a procedure that happens on one side of unconsciousness, while the patient is on the other side. And yet, in these cases, the patients came back from the other side with pieces of the record, small pieces, specific pieces, a nurse who was there for a moment, a gesture the surgeon didn't know he made, a clock on a wall at a particular minute, an arm crossed over a chest in an unusual choice that no one would have thought to tell anyone about, because no one would have thought it mattered. In Sartori's Welsh intensive care unit, the fluorescent lights were on. The staff moved through the room with the efficiency of people who have done this before. The patient on the table was not moving. The nursing record was being kept. And somewhere in the activity of that room, in the careful positioning of a left arm across a chest, in the small procedural decision that someone made and recorded and forgot, because it was simply what the resuscitation required, something was happening that would later become a drawing on a blank piece of paper produced by a man who could not have seen what he was drawing. The drawing matched the record matched the drawing. Sartori held both, the paper and the notes, and the distance between them was not a distance she could measure. Across the cases that researchers like Sabam and Sartori and Grayson and Morse have documented and published and submitted to peer review, the same structural question reasserts itself in each specific detail, in the red line marker on a defibrillator dial, in the crossed arm of a patient who was not awake to feel it crossed, in the words passed between two staff members in the middle of a resuscitation, in the face of a clock at a particular minute. Each detail is small, each is specific, each was confirmed. What confirms a detail is not a feeling or an impression. It is a record, a nursing note, a staff member's testimony, an equipment inventory, a procedural log, the kind of documentation that medical institutions maintain because medicine runs on documentation, because the record is the difference between knowing what happened and only believing it. These details were checked against records, and the records confirmed them. The process was methodical, careful, and in each case limited to what could actually be verified, not to what was suggestive or probable or plausible, but to what could be compared and found to match. The match is the fact. What produced it remains a question that the record does not answer. Dr. Michael Sabam spent years with that question. He sat across from patients in recovery rooms, opened his notebooks, and listened to people describe rooms they had not been awake to see. He compared what they said against what was documented. He found the pattern. He published it. He was not certain what it meant. He was careful to say so. The patients he interviewed were not, for the most part, people who had spent their lives interested in near-death experience or out-of-body perception. Were people who had been in cardiac arrest and had survived it and had woken up with something they had not expected to be carrying, a set of memories from a place and a perspective they had no ordinary means of reaching. A mechanic describing a dial, a patient identifying a nurse who had stepped in for a moment, a man drawing his own arm on a piece of paper. In the pediatric ward, the clock on the wall did not know what it was witnessing. It did not know a code was being called below it. It did not know a child was hovering or reported to be hovering at the level of its face. It knew only what clocks know, which is the position of the hour and the minute and the second, moving forward through whatever is happening in the room, indifferent to cardiac arrest and resuscitation, and the careful entries being made in a nursing record at the desk down the hall. The child described the clock. The nursing entry recorded the time. The minute hand was at a particular number on the wall, and the number was the same in both accounts, and the clock has been on the wall of that pediatric ward through every code that Ward has seen before the child's arrest and after it, and through every admission since, its hands moving steadily forward through whatever it continues to witness. In Book 10 of Plato's Asterix Republic Asterix, written in Athens around 375 BCE, there is a soldier lying among the dead on a battlefield in Pamphylia. His name is Urfing, and he has been there for 10 days. The armies have passed over him. The sky has changed above him 10 times, from dark to light and back. The other bodies around him have begun to decompose in the ordinary way of bodies left in the heat of a Mediterranean summer, and his has not. When the men came to collect the dead and carry them home, they found him unchanged, and they placed him on the funeral pyre with the others. And it was there, as the fire was being prepared, that he opened his eyes. What reported, as Socrates recounts it, was not a dream. It was described as a journey, a passage through a luminous opening, a plane where souls were gathered to be judged, a view of the cosmos that seemed to extend in every direction at once, encounters with the dead, and finally a return to the body that he described as sudden and complete, like waking from a very long and organized sleep. Socrates tells the account without apology or embellishment. He presents it in the careful, reasonable voice he uses for geometry and ethics and the nature of the good. A soldier died on a battlefield in Pamphylia. He lay among the dead for 10 days without decomposing. He returned and described what he had seen. That is what the record says. Scholar Carol Zaleski, in her 1987 book Otherworld Journeys placed Ur's account at the beginning of a very long inventory, not of mythology, not of religious vision, but of structured narrative reports of departure from the body, guided passage, encounter with a boundary, and reluctant return to life, the luminous passage, the judgment of souls, the moment of turning back. She identified these as structural elements, the way a musicologist identifies a recurring motif, not claiming that each occurrence is the same experience, but noting that the shape of the thing recurs with a consistency that deserves careful attention. Zaleski was not arguing for or against any interpretation. She was noting a pattern in the record and asking what a pattern of that persistence across that many centuries meant for any account that tried to explain it. The account of air is the oldest that Zaleski places in this particular tradition. It is not the oldest reported experience of its kind. It is simply the oldest that survives in a form detailed and structured enough to compare with what researchers, 2.5 millennia later, would identify as the consistent phenomenology of the near-death experience. The battlefield is Pamphylia. The year is approximately 375 BCE. The record begins there, not because experience began there, but because writing that has survived began there. And what described has a shape that the record will repeat again and again across the centuries that follow, in places and languages that had no knowledge of Plato's soldier lying still and unchanged among the decaying dead. Approximately 1100 years after Plato was writing in Athens, a monk named Bede was working in a monastery in Northumbria in the north of England, and he was setting down the history of the English church in the careful, organized Latin he used for everything, for lists of councils and the dates of ecclesiastical decisions and the precise wording of papal letters. The asterisk Ecclesiastical History of the English People, asterisk completed around 731 CE, is not primarily a collection of visions. It is a careful institutional record. Bede was concerned with evidence and with accuracy as much as a scholar of his era could be. It is in this context that he includes the account of a Northumbrian man named Drythelm, a man who died, was laid out by his family and revived in the night. What Drythelm reported to Bede, and what Bede recorded with the same attention he gave to council minutes and episcopal appointments, was a guided journey. There was a guide, a figure of light, who walked beside him. There was a valley, long and wide, with one side given over to fire and the other to bitter cold, and souls moving between them in great numbers, driven back and forth by the weather of the valley, like chaff in a high wind. There was a wall at the far end, a boundary Drythelm could not cross, through which he perceived a great and steady radiance. The guide turned him back before he reached it. When he revived on the table where his family had laid him, he was changed, and he spent the remainder of his life in a monastery beside a river, standing in the cold water at night, in a kind of continued turning toward the thing he had seen beyond the wall. The structure of what Drythelm described, the guide, the boundary, the light at the limit of what could be approached, the reluctant return, is the same structure that Karol Zaleski identified in Er's account. Researcher Alan Kelleher, in his cross-cultural work on near-death phenomenology, also noted it. The specific imagery is different. The theology Bede uses to explain it is different from anything Plato would have recognized. But the shape of the journey, the sequence of what Drythelm encountered, and in what order, is sufficiently close to the shape of Er's account and to the shape of accounts that researchers in the 20th century would collect in hospitals in the Netherlands, in the United Kingdom, and the United States, that the resemblance has been treated by several researchers as something requiring a considered account rather than a quick dismissal. He did not place it in a separate category of the marvelous or the miraculous. He placed it in the history. This is worth noting, not because Bede's authority settles anything, but because it tells us something about how the account was held, with the same seriousness, the same careful attention to who said what and when and where that Bede brought to the institutional records of a growing church in a northern land. The account of Drythelm survives not because it was treated as extraordinary. It survives because it was treated as a fact that deserved to be written down. Sometime in the 8th century CE, in what is now Tibet, a teacher known as Padmasambhava is said to have concealed a text in a cliff face near the Gampo Hills, a text that would not be found and transcribed and distributed until the 14th century, when a monk named Karma Lingpa retrieved it from the rock and began making it available to the dying and to those who attended them. The text is known in the West as the Asterisk Bardo Thodol, asterisk, and it describes in precise sequential order the stages of consciousness that a person moves through between death and whatever comes after death. It is not a vision account. It is not one person's report. It is a manual, a systematic guide to a process its authors described with the same specificity that a physician might use to describe the stages of a fever. The first bardo, as the text describes it, is characterized by the appearance of a clear, vast, luminous light, a light that suffuses everything and comes from no particular direction. The text instructs the dying person to recognize this light, to remain with it, not to turn away from it, toward the softer and more manageable lights that will appear around its edges. The softer lights are described as pleasant. The central light is described as brilliant and difficult to hold. The text says that most people will turn away from the central light toward the softer ones, that this is the habitual movement of a mind that has not been trained to remain still in the presence of what is vast and clear. The instructions are addressed directly to the dying, or to someone reading aloud beside the dying, in the expectation that what is being described is something the person will encounter and recognize. Raymond Moody, the the American psychiatrist who published Life After Life. In 1975, the book that introduced the term near-death experience to the general reading public, noted that the descriptions in the Bardo Thadal matched the reports of his patients with a specificity that he found striking. Kenneth Ring, the University of Connecticut researcher, whose work would later include the MindSight study of congenitally blind NDE subjects, made the same observation in his own writing. They were not arguing that the Bardo Thadal proved anything about what happens after death. They were noting that a 14th century Tibetan text describing the phenomenology of dying in a tradition with no connection to the hospital wards of Hartford or Southampton or Amsterdam contained a sequence of experiences: the luminous light encountered first, the guidance through stages, the panoramic review, the boundary, the return, that matched what their patients were describing in clinical interviews conducted by researchers who had never read Padmasambhava. The Bardo Thorol was composed in a tradition that held detailed, continuous attention to the process of dying across many centuries of practice and observation. Whether that tradition was attending to something real or constructing a map of something that exists only in the minds of the dying is a question the text itself does not settle. And it is not a question that the presence of the text in the research literature settles either. What the text adds to the record is not proof of anything. It adds a data point, another instance of a structured description of the same journey. From a culture and a century so distant from the clinical wards where the modern data was collected that the resemblance must be accounted for by something other than shared reading. In the Swiss Alps in the 1870s and 1880s, a geologist named Albert Heim began doing something that had not been done before. He was asking people to describe in detail the moments when they nearly died, the moment the rope gave way on a mountain face, the moment the ledge crumbled, the moment the soldier felt the bullet arrive and the ground come up, and he was writing down what they said. Heim had survived a near-fatal fall himself in 1871 on the Sentis mountain, and what he had experienced in that fall, the complete cessation of pain, the sense of expanded time, the panoramic review of his life, the feeling of calm that seemed to organize itself around him like something arriving from outside, had struck him as sufficiently different from anything he could account for in ordinary physiological terms, that he spent the next 20 years collecting similar accounts wherever he could find them. The paper Heim eventually published in 1892 in the Yearbook of the Swiss Alpine Club was titled Notiz über den Tod durch Absturz Notes on Death from Falling. It contained approximately 30 testimonies from people who had survived near-fatal accidents in a variety of circumstances: alpine climbers, construction workers who had fallen from scaffolding, soldiers who had been shot and left for dead on the battlefield. The consistency across those 30 accounts was what Heim had been tracking. The cessation of pain was reported by nearly all of them. The panoramic review of the life, specific memories appearing in rapid sequence with unusual clarity, was reported by a substantial portion, and the sense of arriving at a place of calm or light before the recovery of ordinary consciousness was described across multiple accounts by people who had no contact with one another and no shared vocabulary for what they were reporting. Neuropsychiatrist Russell Noyes and his colleague Roy Cletty encountered Heim's paper in the early 1970s, translated it, and published it in the journal Omega in 1972. They noted that Heim had produced in 1892 and without the benefit of modern research infrastructure, the first systematic empirical collection of near-death testimonies in Western scientific literature, a collection that anticipated by more than 80 years the findings of researchers who would collect similar accounts in hospital settings using standardized interview instruments. The mountain is not the hospital ward. The rope breaking in a high alpine gully is not the cardiac arrest monitor flatlying in a Southampton resuscitation bay, but the phenomenology that Himes climbers and soldiers described, the cessation of pain, the review, the light, the calm, is close enough to the phenomenology that Parnia's patient 10 and Van Lomel's Dutch cardiac patients described, that the resemblance sits in the record, patient and unhurried, and does not go away. What Heim himself thought about his collection was characteristically careful. He did not claim his data proved anything about survival of consciousness or the existence of an afterlife. He noted that people who nearly died consistently reported a particular cluster of experiences, that the cluster was recognizable across very different circumstances and very different people, and that the cluster was not distressing, that people who had been through what should have been the most terrible moment of their lives often described it afterward as something they were not afraid of in the way they expected to be afraid of death. He left the explanation to others. He was a geologist. He had collected the rocks. What the rocks meant was someone else's work. Albert Heim's paper sat in the Swiss Alpine Club's yearbook for 80 years before Noyes and Cletty found it and brought it into the modern research conversation. The accounts it contains, written down in the 1880s in a basement of a Swiss Valley inn over coffee in a researcher's clear handwriting, describe the same journey that described on his funeral pyre in Pamphylia, that Drytholm described to Bede beside his Northumbrian river, that Padmasambhava's text addressed to the dying in Tibet 6 centuries before Heim was born. The specific images differ. The theological frames differ. The cultures are as different as cultures can be. The shape of the thing described does not differ. This is the detail that Alan Kelleher spent a significant portion of his career attending to. Kelleher's 1996 book, * Experiences Near Death, Beyond Medicine and Religion, *, was a cross-cultural analysis, not a collection of hospital case files, but a systematic comparison of NDE accounts drawn from more than 30 non-Western cultural contexts, each documented in anthropological literature by researchers working within those traditions. Kelleher's method was structural. He was looking for the elements, out-of-body departure, encounter with deceased ancestors or guides, the presence of a boundary the experiencer could not or would not cross, a return to life that was understood to carry some form of transformed purpose, and asking where these elements appeared and where they did not, and whether their distribution across cultures could be accounted for by shared media, shared religious teaching, or any form of cultural transmission. Among the traditions Kelleher examined were the accounts documented by anthropologist Lee Irwin in his work with Lakota, Ojibwe, and Pacific Northwest Coast indigenous communities. Irwin's records, collected in the late 20th century and held in the academic record with the interview date, the location on the reservation, and the family name of the person who offered the account, describe men and women who entered death-like states through illness, through ceremony, through accident, and returned, describing journeys through a spirit landscape populated by ancestors. The departure from the body is present. The encounter with beings who are recognized as known dead is present. The boundary, a river, a wall, a line in the earth that cannot be crossed, is present. The return that is not entirely voluntary, the sense of being turned back from something one would otherwise continue into, is present. These accounts were not produced by people who had access to Raymond Moody's books. They were not produced by people who had been told in a hospital intake interview what the expected features of a near-death experience were. They were produced in communities whose relationship to death and dying, and what lay beyond dying, was organized entirely by traditions that predated any Western clinical vocabulary by centuries. Irwin documented them with the same academic care he brought to the documentation of ceremonial practices and kinship structures, as data about how a community understood and narrated a category of human experience, held alongside everything else the community knew. Kelleher's conclusion, careful, measured, and published in a rigorous academic press, was that the structural elements he had identified could not be satisfactorily accounted for by shared religious indoctrination or by the influence of modern media. The cross-cultural distribution was too wide, the temporal distribution too long, the structural consistency too precise for those explanations to carry all the weight placed on them. He was not arguing that the experience was what its subjects believed it to be. He was arguing that the experience, its shape, its sequence, its recurring elements, appeared in the record with a regularity that deserved more than a dismissal from any direction, and that any account of it would need to hold the full weight of what the record actually contained. The record is not small. This is one of the things that becomes clear when the material is laid out in full, not as individual cases, but as a body of documented accounts stretching across 25 centuries of human writing and an even longer reach of oral tradition. The accounts come from climbers in the Swiss Alps and soldiers on Pamphylian battlefields. They come from Northumbrian men laid out for burial in the 8th century and from Welsh intensive care patients in the late 20th century. They come from communities in Tibet and communities on the plains of North America and communities in the Pacific Northwest, each with its own vocabulary for the experience and its own framework for what the experience meant. And across all of them, with a persistence that has now been noted by multiple independent researchers working in multiple independent disciplines, the shape of the thing described is recognizably the same shape. There is the departure. The body is left behind. The perspective from which experience continues is not located in the body that is lying still, and the accounts consistently describe this shift as a fact of perception rather than a metaphor. There is the movement through light, through landscape, along a path that has direction without being a physical path in any ordinary sense. There are the figures, ancestors, guides, recognized dead, whose presence is described across traditions as warm and organizing rather than frightening. There is the boundary, the wall, the river, the edge of the light, the line that cannot be crossed, which recurs with a frequency that Kelleher and Zaleski both identified as structurally significant. And there is the return, never entirely voluntary, always described as a turning back from something the experiencer would have continued into, and always described as a turning back that carried something with it. What is carried back differs across cultures and centuries, as one would expect. A return from Pamphylia with a vision of cosmic justice that Plato found philosophically useful. Drythelm returned to his monastery and his cold river with a kind of sustained orientation toward what he had seen beyond the wall. Heim's climbers returned from the mountain face with a changed relationship to the fear of death, a change Heim himself noted with careful interest, because he had collected it across 30 accounts independently and found it consistent. The ICU patient in Wales returned from his bypass surgery with an accurate description of his own arm position and a memory of something the nursing notes confirmed. The specific content of the return varies, The structure of the thing being returned from does not vary much. This is the observation that sits at the center of Kelleher's comparative work, and it is the observation that Albert Heim had made in simpler form before Kelleher was born. The persistence of the structure is the finding, not the interpretation of the structure, not the explanation of the structure. The finding is simply that the structure is there, in the record, across the full range of what the record contains, across battlefields and monasteries and Tibetan cliff faces and Swiss alpine gullies and Welsh intensive care units and resuscitation bays in Southampton, and that it has been there for at least 25 centuries of documented human writing, and presumably much longer in the traditions that predate writing. Albert Heim's accounts from the 1880s are held in the Swiss Alpine Club's archive in Zurich. The paper is old enough that the pages have the quality of pressed leaves, thin and yellowed at the edges, the ink still clear at the center of the page. Russell Noyes and Roy Cletty worked from a copy in the early 1970s, and their translation is what brought Heim's accounts into the modern research literature, where they sit alongside the Dutch cardiac data and the AWARE study transcripts and the Ring and Cooper interviews with congenitally blind subjects. All of this material now occupies the same research conversation, the mountain guide and the cardiac patient, the 1880s Swiss Valley, and the 2001 Southampton General Resuscitation Bay, Heim's handwritten notes and Parnia's peer-reviewed tables, and what they hold in common is not proof of any single interpretation, but the persistent, documented shape of something that has not been fully explained. The cross-cultural work that Kelleher published in 1996 has not been significantly challenged on its evidentiary foundation. The accounts from Irwin's fieldwork remain in the academic record. The Tibetan text remains in the research literature. Ars Appliers account in Plato's asterisk republic asterisk remains where it has always been. What these accounts do not do, collectively or individually, is settle the question of what experience they are describing, or what that experience is, at the level of what actually happens when a person comes close enough to death that the body stops and the experience continues. That question is one the record holds open, firmly and patiently, from the battlefield at Pamphylia to the present. What Kelleher's comparative study ultimately presents, its rows of cultural accounts laid out across research notes, each from a different tradition, each from a different century, each documented by a different researcher working in a different country in a different decade, is a kind of map, not a map of the afterlife, not a map of what consciousness is or where it goes, a map of what has been reported across an enormous range of human contexts, with a structural consistency that has now been noted in the record by enough independent observers that the consistency itself is a finding, whatever the finding is taken to mean. The research notes are still there. 30 cultures, more than 30 accounts. The structural elements laid out in parallel columns, departure, guide, boundary, return, appearing in one column after another, in accounts that have no line of transmission between them, no shared text they could all have read, no missionary or traveler who could account for their resemblance. The Lakota account, documented by Lee Irwin on a reservation in the late 20th century, the interview date recorded in the notes, the family name of the person who offered the account recorded beside it, the asterisk Bardo Thodol, asterisk text, its instructions addressed to the dying in a voice that presupposes familiarity with the territory being described. The Swiss climber's account written down in Heim's clear hand in a valley inn while the mountain was still visible through the window. The soldier on the pyre in Pamphylia, his eyes opening in the firelight, describing a luminous passage he had been turned back from, before reaching its far end. The same shape, the same sequence, the same direction of travel, and the same reluctant turning back. Across centuries and continents, and languages and traditions that had no knowledge of one another, and across the clinical wards and resuscitation bays of the modern research hospital, in the accounts of people who were monitored and interviewed, and whose reports were cross-checked against nursing records and staff testimony and EEG traces and blood gas measurements. The material is all in the record. It has been there for a long time. And the question at the center of it, the question of what all these accounts from all these places and all these centuries are describing, remains open, unhurried, and unfilled, the way a question remains open when the evidence for it is very old and very wide and has not yet found the answer that can hold it. In a sleep research laboratory at the University of Kentucky in the early 2000s, Kevin Nelson and his colleagues were working through the data that would eventually become a paper in the journal Neurology, in 2006. The hypothesis they had developed was careful and grounded in well-established sleep science. It proposed that the distinctive features of near-death experiences, the sensation of leaving the body, the encounter with light, the feeling of profound calm, arose not from any process unique to dying, but from something familiar to every sleeping brain, the intrusion of REM characteristics into waking consciousness at a moment of physiological crisis. The mechanism was known. The components were documented. The paper, when it appeared, represented a genuine contribution to a conversation that had been running for decades without a satisfying center. Pearson's team found that people who reported near-death experiences were significantly more likely than controls to have also reported REM intrusion events in their lives, the sudden brief paralysis of waking from sleep, the hypnagogic visions at the threshold of unconsciousness, the sense of presence that arrives at the edge of sleep and dissolves when the room becomes familiar again. These were recognized neurological phenomena. Their association with NDE reporters was statistically measurable. The paper laid out its argument methodically, and the argument was worth taking seriously because it pointed toward a physical mechanism that did not require anything outside the known operations of the brain. The data tables held what they held. The statistical association was real. And then, beside the paper, not in it, but beside it, in the same ongoing conversation, sat the findings from Kenneth Ring and Sharon Cooper's Mindsight study, published in 1999. That study had documented the near-death experiences of individuals who had been blind since birth. Not blind since an accident, not blind since early childhood, after some period of visual experience, but congenitally blind, people for whom no visual memory existed, for whom the architecture of REM dreaming, which in sighted people is predominantly visual, had never been built in the same way. The question the REM intrusion hypothesis had not fully answered was what it meant that these individuals reported accurate visual experiences during their near-death episodes. Vicky Umipeg had never seen anything in her life. The visual cortex was present in her brain. The neural structures associated with vision were there in the same anatomical positions they occupied in anyone else. But the experience of sight, the learned, practiced, memory-built experience of seeing the world and filing it away, was not part of her neurological history, and during her near-death experience, she reported looking down at her own body from above, identifying her long blonde hair, the plaid shirt she was wearing, the gold wedding ring on her hand. She identified these things with the vocabulary of someone who had been told what colors and textures were, not with the vocabulary of someone who had seen them, and yet the specificity of what she described corresponded to what was actually there, verified by cited witnesses in the room. The REM intrusion model, holding its data tables, did not provide a mechanism for that. This is not an argument that the REM intrusion model was wrong. It is an observation that its predictions did not reach everywhere the documented cases went. That is a different thing. Good science produces hypotheses that are testable, and the test of a hypothesis is exactly this: whether it accounts for the full range of the evidence, or whether some portion of the evidence sits outside what the model can reach. The cases that sat outside were not invented to defeat the hypothesis. They were in the files before the hypothesis arrived. Wilder Penfield operated on conscious patients. This was not unusual in certain kinds of neurosurgery in the 1950s, where the patient's ability to report their experience in real time was a navigational tool, a way of telling the surgeon where the functional boundaries of the brain lay as the electrode moved across the cortex. At the Montreal Neurological Institute, Penfield worked with epilepsy patients whose skulls were open under local anesthetic, their brains exposed and touchable, the patients awake and talking to him through the procedure. When he touched certain regions of the temporal lobe with a small electrical current, patients reported extraordinary things. They reported vivid memories arriving without warning. They reported the sensation of leaving their bodies. They reported feeling as though they were watching themselves from a point above the operating table. These reports were documented carefully. They were, for a long time, taken as strong evidence that the out-of-body experience was a product of temporal lobe activity, that stimulating the right region produced the experience reliably, which meant the experience belonged to the brain, could be switched on from the outside, and was in that sense reducible to electrical events in tissue. The argument had considerable force. Olaf Blanqui, working at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne and publishing an Nature in 2002, identified the temporoparietal junction as a site where electrical stimulation reproducibly produced out-of-body sensations, and the paper was widely cited as bringing the neurological explanation of the OBE onto firmer ground. Penfield himself had noticed something. It was in his own notes, from his own observations of his own patients, which is what gave it a particular weight in the subsequent conversation. His patients, when the electrode touched the cortex and the experiences arrived, knew the experiences were not real. They reported them with the specific quality of something happening to them from outside, something produced, something mechanical, something that had been switched on, and that they were watching from a slight distance even as it occurred. The patient lying on the table with the skull open and the electrode at the temporal lobe would say, "Something is coming, something is happening, I feel as though I'm lifting," and simultaneously, because they were conscious and articulate and fully present in the room, they would also say, "I know this isn't real, I know it's the machine." This was not what NDE reporters said. Without exception, in Van Lommel's study, in Parnia's, and the accumulated testimony across decades of research, patients who had returned from cardiac arrest described their near-death experiences not as the most vivid dream they had ever had, not as a hallucination they had watched with interest from a clinical distance, but as the most real experience of their lives, more real than the room they were currently sitting in, more real than the conversation they were currently having. The phenomenological quality, the specific texture of the experience as the person had lived it, was directly opposite to what Penfield's patients reported. His patients knew it was artificial even as it arrived. The NDE reporters consistently described something that felt more real than ordinary reality, not less. Van Lommel noted this distinction in his published responses to the temporal lobe stimulation literature. The distinction is a phenomenological one, not a neurological one. It lives in the quality of the experience as reported, not in a measurement taken by an instrument. That makes it harder to operationalize. It also makes it harder to dismiss, because the consistency across thousands of separate accounts, gathered by different researchers in different countries across several decades, was not something that could be explained by shared cultural expectation alone. The felt reality of the experience was reported as distinctly anomalous, as categorically different from ordinary dreaming, hallucination, or the induced quasi-visions of electrical stimulation by people who had no knowledge of each other and no obvious reason to agree on precisely this feature. The endorphin hypothesis occupied a different explanatory register. It did not try to account for the visual content or the spatial precision of NDE reports. It addressed the emotional quality, the profound calm, the cessation of pain, the absence of fear, and proposed that these arose from a massive release of endogenous opioids during the physiological crisis of cardiac arrest or severe trauma. The body under extreme stress produces its own analgesics. This is documented. It is the mechanism behind the well-attested phenomenon of soldiers who sustain serious wounds in combat and do not register the pain until the immediate danger passes. The chemistry was real. The hypothesis was grounded. The problem was what it did not address. Endorphin release produces euphoria. It produces reduced pain. It does not produce organized visual imagery. It does not produce the spatial accuracy of a patient looking down at a specific room and identifying the position of a nurse who stepped in briefly and stepped out again. It does not produce the structured narrative of a journey with recognizable stages, the departure from the body, the tunnel, the encounter with light, the meeting with figures, the return. These were not features of the opioid experience. The endorphin hypothesis, taken seriously as an account of the emotional register of NDE reports, left the informational content of those reports entirely unaddressed, and the informational content, the specific, verifiable details, the accurate descriptions of rooms and instruments and people, was precisely what the research literature had spent 4 decades trying to account for. Researchers including Van Lommel acknowledged the endorphin mechanism as a plausible explanation of one subset of what NDE reporters described. They were careful not to dismiss it. They were equally careful to point out that partial explanations, however accurate in their domain, do not close the question they are invoked to answer. The calm was accounted for. The vision of the worn tennis shoe on the 3rd floor ledge, the surgeon's particular elbow gesture, the nurse who entered briefly. These waited outside the mechanism, patient and undissolved. Carbon dioxide. This was one of the more straightforward predictions to test. The hypercarbia hypothesis proposed that elevated CO2 levels in the blood produced by the failure of normal respiration during cardiac arrest could account for the unusual perceptual experiences reported by survivors, that the brain, starved of normal gas exchange, generated anomalous experiences as a kind of byproduct of its metabolic distress. The hypoxia hypothesis made a related but distinct claim that reduced oxygen rather than elevated CO2 was the triggering mechanism. Both hypotheses had the advantage of pointing toward measurable biological variables. If they were correct, patients who reported near-death experiences should have blood gas profiles that differed systematically from those who did not. Van Lommel's team in the Dutch study measured blood gas levels in cardiac arrest patients and compared them between the group that reported near-death experiences and the group that did not. The comparison found no statistically significant difference. The CO2 levels were not higher in the NDE group. The oxygen levels were not lower, whatever distinguished a cardiac arrest patient who would later report an NDE from one who would not. It did not appear to be in the gas composition of their blood during the arrest. The prediction of both models had not been confirmed. Susan Blackmore had been one of the more prominent advocates of the hypoxia model in the 1980s and early 1990s. Her 1993 book *Dying to Live* laid out the case for oxygen deprivation as the central mechanism producing the tunnel experience, the sense of light, the altered perception. She had done the intellectual work of building the hypothesis into a coherent explanatory framework. When Van Lummel's data appeared in *The Lancet* in 2001, Blackmore was among those who engaged with it seriously. She conceded, in the subsequent conversation in the literature, that oxygen deprivation, as she had modeled it, did not produce the organized, narratively coherent, structurally consistent experiences that NDE reports described. The hypoxia mechanism, operating on a brain in crisis, would be expected to produce fragmentary and confused experiences, not the structured, sequential, often luminously clear accounts that survivors consistently reported. The concession was made in good faith by someone who had spent years building the model she was revising. It did not mean the question was answered. It meant the answer it had seemed to offer did not quite reach. The timing problem is the deepest one. It does not depend on any particular hypothesis. It arises from what standard clinical measurement tells us about the brain during cardiac arrest, and it sits at the center of the unresolved question like a specific quiet fact that none of the proposed mechanisms has yet addressed on its own terms. Standard EEG monitoring of cardiac arrest patients has established that electrical activity in the brain, the measurable signature of neuronal communication, of the coordinated firing that underlies thought and perception and memory, flatlines within 10 to 20 seconds of the heart stopping. The cerebral cortex, the outermost layer of the brain, responsible for conscious experience, for sensory processing, for the formation and encoding of memory, is among the first regions to lose function. This is not disputed. It is what the instruments record, repeatedly and consistently, in clinical settings across different hospitals and different countries. The experiences that patients describe are associated in their own reports consistently across the research literature, not with the moments just before or just after the cardiac arrest, but with the deepest phase of unconsciousness, not the descent into it, not the ascent out, the period of flatline. Patients who recover from cardiac arrest and report near-death experiences place the content of those experiences in the window of clinical death itself, the period during which, according to the EEG record, the brain was not generating the electrical patterns associated with conscious experience, memory formation, or sensory processing. This is the timing problem. It is not a philosophical problem, or a cultural one, or a matter of how we interpret what survivors describe. It is a timing problem. The experiences are placed by their reporters in a window for which current neuroscience has no established mechanism of conscious experience generation. That is a statement about what the science currently has and has not been able to establish. It is not a statement about what is or is not possible. The history of science contains many things that were not possible until they were explained, and many explanations that resolved problems their predecessors had no tools to approach. The timing problem may eventually receive an explanation that sits entirely within the framework of established neuroscience. That explanation has not yet appeared in the published literature. Jamo Borjigin's laboratory at the University of Michigan published a study in the Asterisk Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Asterisk in 2013, that offered a partial approach to the timing problem. Her team measured EEG activity in dying rats in the seconds immediately following induced cardiac arrest and found something that the experimental design had not necessarily anticipated: a brief, intense surge of highly synchronized gamma wave activity in the first 30 seconds following cardiac arrest, a burst of coordinated electrical activity in a brain that should, by conventional expectation, have been quieting. The finding was striking. It suggested that the transition from living to dead brain involved, at least briefly, a period of unusual neural coordination rather than simple decline. The finding was genuine and carefully reported. It was also carefully contextualized by the researchers who engaged with it in the subsequent literature. Sam Parnia noted that NDE reports the organized, narratively coherent, spatially specific accounts that survivors described were associated with periods of clinical death lasting not seconds but minutes. The gamma surge in Borjigin's data lasted less than 30 seconds before the signal flattened and the characteristic EEG silence of cardiac death descended. The window identified was real. It was also considerably smaller than the window implicated by the NDE reports themselves. The finding pointed towards something interesting in the first seconds of cardiac death. It did not account for experiences placed by their reporters in the extended period of flatline that followed. These are the conversations that the research literature holds as of its most recent published chapters. They are not finished conversations. Van Lomel's Dutch study, published in The Lancet, in 2001, was the result of more than a decade of clinical work across 10 hospitals, 344 patients, and a research design that had been specifically constructed to address the weaknesses in earlier, more informal approaches to the phenomenon. Parnia's AWARE studies brought the same methodological seriousness to the question of veridical out-of-body perception, placing concealed targets in hospital resuscitation bays, enrolling thousands of cardiac arrest patients, attempting to construct the conditions under which the question of accurate perception during clinical death could be answered with the kind of specificity the question deserved. The work has been slow and painstaking and inconclusive, in the sense that science is inconclusive when the evidence does not yet resolve cleanly. That is not a failure of the science. It is the science doing what science does, following the evidence to the edge of what is currently understood, and stopping there with the findings cataloged and the question still open. The University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies in Charlottesville holds the documentation. It has held it for decades through several changes of leadership and several generations of researchers, each inheriting the filing cabinets from the last and continuing the work of interview, documentation, and cross-checking that the field requires. The Grayson NDE scale, the 16-item standardized instrument developed by Bruce Grayson, the most widely cited assessment tool in the research literature, was built to make the comparison of cases possible across different researchers and different populations, to bring some methodological consistency to a field that had previously relied on less structured approaches. The scale is an instrument. It measures what it measures. It does not resolve the question of what the experiences it catalogs mean or where they arise from. It makes the question more precisely askable. There is a particular document in the archive of Van Lomel's research. It is a case file, patient number, date, hospital, duration of cardiac arrest, EEG trace, resuscitation record, and clipped to the inside of the folder the patient's own written account of what they experienced during the period of clinical death. The EEG trace shows a flat green line across the paper. The description beside it is organized and specific. Both documents are from the same hour of the same day in the same body. They sit next to each other in the folder as they have sat for more than 20 years. The flat line and the account, the silence and the experience, present in the same file, without contradiction and without resolution. There are hundreds of these files. They exist in Charlottesville, and in Amsterdam, and in Southampton, and in Cardiff, and in research archives across several countries on several continents. They were built by researchers who spent careers on the question and retired without a final answer, passing the files to the next researcher who passed them to the next. The question did not resolve between one generation of researchers and the next. It simply continued, documented more carefully, measured more precisely, held with more methodological rigor, still open. The flat green line on the EEG trace is a specific thing. It is a record of measurement taken by an instrument in a room at a specific time. The patient account beside it is also a specific thing, handwritten or dictated or assembled from interview notes, describing an experience in the particular language of the person who had it. Neither document explains the other. They do not cancel each other out. They do not resolve into a single account of what happened. They remain in the same folder as they have always been, two records of the same event, from positions that have not yet been reconciled. In the records of Van Lamole's Dutch study, one patient, numbered, anonymized, their identity held separately in the clinical records, described the experience of looking down at the resuscitation team from a position above the room. They described specific things. The description was checked against the resuscitation record, against the testimony of the staff present. The correspondences were noted. The case was filed with the others, not singled out, not held up as the case that settled the question, because the question had not been settled, and one case, however precise its verified details, does not settle it. What it does is sit in the folder and continue to be what it is. All of it continues in this way. The clinical files at Southampton, the interview transcripts in Charlottesville, the published studies in the journal Archives, *, The Lancet, *, Resuscitation, the *, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, *, sitting on servers and in bound volumes in university libraries in several countries. The question in them has not changed since the first careful researcher sat down with the first recovering cardiac arrest patient and asked them to describe what they remembered. Something had happened in the interval between the heart stopping and the heart starting again. Something had been perceived or experienced or constructed, and the description of it, when it was checked against the record of what had actually been in the room, corresponded in ways that the available explanations had not yet fully accounted for. The explanations are still being offered. New instruments are being brought to the question.